I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector Podcast. And it's been a busy week, and I am joined by Chris Temple of the National Investor to help sort all of this mayhem out. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Mike, and we'll do our best.
Yeah, well, we've had, one thing on itself would be enough to move markets and change economics insights, but we had two of them. Your election happened on Tuesday night. We had a Fed announcement this afternoon. So let's talk Tuesday night in the wee hours of the morning in Eastern Time. They declared that the Orange Wonder had taken the presidency, and we've got another term of Donald Trump coming our way.
Yeah, Trump 2.0 is what we're all going to get ready for. The second time in U.S. history, for those that don't know, that a president has served two terms, but not back to back, the other one being Grover Cleveland in the late 1800s. And, when you and I talked a little bit several days ago, and I was kind of handicapping the situation, I told you that my gut told me that Trump could win. I wouldn't have wanted to bet my life on it, but it seemed to be pointing that direction. I was more concerned about, whether the whole vote count was going to be honest or there was going to be more shenanigans. I was concerned about it being a Bush versus Gore kind of photo finish that was going to cause all kinds of angst and whatnot. And I thought that if we did have a good, honest count, that Trump could win, and it might not be razor thin as most of the handicapping was. But I don't think anybody in their fondest dreams would have predicted, I certainly didn't, that Trump would not only win, but do it in as comfortable and as broad based a fashion as we ended up seeing, sweeping every single one of the so called swing states pretty much. As you and I are recording this, they still don't have the official numbers for Arizona and Nevada. I think are the two outstanding ones. He may narrowly lose Nevada. It looks like he's going to win Arizona. The Senate swung more to Republican side than the slight margin that was expected. And when most of the betting, political wise, was that the Democrats would take back the House. And again, this is not official still, but it looks like the Republicans have got about an 80 or 90% chance to actually keep the House when some of the final too close to call races are called. So this was something that, rightly so, a lot of people were saying, even on the Trump derangement syndrome driven legacy media in the US, that you can't say this was anything more than one of the greatest comebacks in US political history. A lot of people were comparing it to when Richard Nixon lost the presidential election by a squeaker in 1960 to John Kennedy, and famously said, all right, well, you don't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. But then he came back 8 years later and won the presidency, and then got kicked around a whole hell of a lot afterwards over Watergate. But this has been a great comeback for the president politically, no question about it. The question on everybody's mind now, from a cultural standpoint, a national security standpoint, an economic and market standpoint, is that will Trump 2.0 fulfill the largely unfulfilled promises of Trump 1.0? And there's a lot of moving parts to that.
Yeah, well, we're gonna, because we deal in the financial world, we're gonna talk about the Trump 2.0 and the economy going forward, and um, what he said he's going to do, what he's probably capable of doing, whether or not his policies are good, bad, or are going to cause other problems. So let's take a run at that. The first and the broadest thing that he wants to do is raise tariffs on everything. His favorite word, as he put it, is tariff, 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 tariff. Um, that's hugely inflationary, and it's going to affect goods coming into America all the way up and down the chain.
The
Um,
most beautiful word in the English language. I mean, the most beautiful of all time. Tariff.
Yeah, yeah, that word.
Yeah.
Um, I, as wearing my economics hat, look at it and go, Okay, well, this could be, hugely inflationary. As you know, as our listeners know, I'm Canadian, so as a Canadian looking at the goods that we ship to our largest trading partner getting hit with tariffs, I can't see that being necessarily a good thing for my country. But I'm trying to remain pragmatic over the overall bigger picture here. So, does Trump follow through with that particular plan, or was that a lot of campaign? I don't want to say nonsense, but campaign rhetoric.
The usual campaign rhetoric where the candidate is full of more shit than a Christmas goose. That is the case, Mike. In my view, Kamala Harris said we're going to reopen the issue of reparations for descendants of slaves, even though some of her forebears owned slaves and traded in them. Comical, it wasn't going to go anywhere. And neither are some of the things that President Trump suggested going to go anywhere. He has unilateral authority in some senses to impose tariffs without Congress, but in a broad sense, as far as economic policy and the mercantilist policy that he will pursue again more energetically than under Trump 1.0, he needs Congress to debate and vote on these things. I'll be talking about this in more detail in the very near term in a national investor, but one of the members of his transition team, who is the point man on this very subject, Howard Lutnick, gave a great interview to CNBC a few weeks back and basically said, and I'm paraphrasing and characterizing this just for simplicity and time's sake, but no, don't believe you're going to get every one of these things. You're not going to have this across the board tariff policy on everything. It's going to be more surgical than Trump is letting on. And you got to keep in mind it's going to be focused on industries that we can protect. Trump himself has wanted to make a big deal out of comparing himself to William McKinley, who also was a mercantilist Republican business type who used tariffs, but he used tariffs in two ways radically different than the landscape that Trump faces. Number one, he was more surgical about it. Number two, he did it at a time when America had industries to protect and was using the both weapon and revenue raiser of tariffs in from a position of strength when the US in those days had a strong broad-based manufacturing and related industries, and we had not sent all of those overseas. The problem that Trump has, and I question the extent to which he truly understands all of this, either intellectually or economically, is that he wants to do all of this stuff and be a mercantilist from a position of relative weakness. When take electric vehicles for example, this is a nascent industry in the US. We don't by and large have all of the food chain in place to produce electric vehicles from ground to the finished product within our own four walls, but yet he wants to impose all these tariffs on imports from China chiefly. Well, what does that mean for consumers? Higher costs without anything domestically to compete against that. Now someday we'll have it, and there will be some good stuff coming out of Trump and the Congress to accelerate mining reform, permitting reform, all of the different food chain, do away with some of the layers and layers of lawsuits that can slow down products like or projects and so forth. But that's going to take a lot of years to have that all in place under the best scenario. So, tariffs are inflationary, but they're inflationary in a bad way because not only will they raise prices, all else being equal for the average person, but they eventually dent demand if you have a weak economy. So you're kind of shooting, you're cutting off your nose to spite your face if you want a strong economy. So look, there's a time and a place for tariffs. Some of the stuff will be good. Some of it has not been well thought out yet, but happily with people like Lutnick, people, otherwise, they will craft a policy that goes deeper and I think makes more sense than the Archie Bunker type knee jerk reaction.
Yeah, well, the one thing about tariffs is tariffs beget more tariffs because,
Right.
I put a tariff on this and you put a tariff on that, and before you know it, that was one of the causes of the Great Depression in the 1930s was tariffs, and everybody, essentially trying to ruin each other's economies. And that's another gauge as this start to break the supply chain again, because China or whomever decides, okay, well, we'll sell those goods someplace else where they're not going to have tariffs on them. And does it hurt American industries that are trying to access other countries that are being hit with American tariffs, so they put tariffs on American goods?
Well, here's the other issue too, and this is a real big rabbit hole to go down that maybe we'll save for another day. But keep in mind, the reason why China is trying to force feed all of this ever cheaper production onto the rest of the world is they are at completely opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to inflation and whatnot than the US is. We still have a moderately inflationary policy. It may be a much more inflationary policy if everything Trump wants to do is enacted, all else being equal. On the other hand, China has a desperate need to undercut the rest of the world by selling all of their surplus production. Because if they don't, they collapse into a broader deflation and drag all the rest of the world with them. So you got these two polar opposite situations economically and inflation wise right now. I don't know how they resolve themselves, Mike. I really don't without a mess. But this is why China's doing what they're doing. And yes, they do have other places, tariffs going up. The European Union has been wringing their hands over this for a while. And sometimes, with some honesty over there, people in Europe saying, hey, maybe we just need to hold our nose and buy these cheap imports of EVs from China because we don't have the will or the ability to have the whole food chain ourselves within our own borders. It's there, but politically we can't do it. I mean, over in Eastern Europe right now, you got, the biggest lithium project in Europe that Rio Tinto owns. I think it's in Serbia. Correct me if I'm wrong. They don't want it. They want EVs, but they don't want the lithium mine. So I don't think the US is in that bad a situation. And if we did unleash our own ability to produce these things, and there is some hope that that's going to start to come about in a bigger way, we can have legit competition with China, maybe protecting these rebounding industries with tariffs until we get to the right place. But again, the notion that people got from the overly simplistic electioneering stuff from the president elect again is just going to be all tariff this and tariff that. And no, it's not going to be that easy. And I don't think it's going to happen in the end. There are going to be some smarter people that are in the room that craft a broader policy that we'll use tariffs, which I'm not opposed to, in the right way.
Yeah, and there was another challenge that I personally found with the tariff argument, because he wants to put the tariffs on Chinese goods, and the Chinese government, for their own best interest, and they look after the interest of China, has been building factories and plants for things like solar panels, for electric vehicles, and for other materials in Mexico. Now, those companies and those goods would have been covered under the new USMC free trade agreement that Trump himself actually had negotiated after he blew up the NAFTA agreement. That was going to become hugely problematic, putting tariffs on goods made in Mexico entering the United States, contrary to the USMC. And it's to me that was another challenge to his blanket tariff for everyone kind of policies. How safe do you think USMC would be under the Trump administration? It is his agreement, but it's he's also known for tearing up agreements he's negotiated in good faith in his personal life.
Well, it's not going to be very safe, but for different reasons than what you just said, I think to a great extent. Claudia Scheinbaum has already made clear that she has no use for Trump. Trump had a grudging respect for AMLO, the recently departed president of Mexico because AMLO is another strong man and nationalist that was looking out for number one, and Trump respects that, which is why he, gravitates towards strong leaders, because those strong leaders in his eyes are looking out for their country. And there's no reason to disrespect that unless it's a direct, strategic threat or military threat to the US. We don't have that, of course. But, Claudia Scheinbaum, even with the vote official in the US, is holding out for, believe it or not, I had to read this twice, holding out for Arizona and Nevada in the final vote count before she wants to congratulate the president and blah, blah. Um, you know, Trump has already said that they have smoked out ways in which China is evading tariffs by going through Mexico. They've got their eye on that. Mexico has, and I agree with them on this decision. They don't want genetically modified crops from the US and Mexico. That was something that was done under AMLO. Scheinbaum is on board with that. I think that we are going to have, and no one's paid attention to this because all the talk has been about China and Russia and the Middle East, but I think that we got a rat's nest on our hands, and it's going to be as much over the grading of personalities between Trump and Scheinbaum as it is over economics. So I think that one of the black swan events that's looming out there that nobody has on their bingo card is that we're going to see some major upheavals with this, you know, NAFTA successor.
Well, it was kind of sort of on my bingo card because I did bring it up, but now does it draw Canada into that battle, or is it going to be simply a US Mexico issue?
I don't know. It depends on how all of this is characterized. Will Justin Castro or Trudeau, will he side with his closer ideological partner in Mexico and try and box in the US and exact some concessions from Trump? I don't know. I mean, on the surface, it really shouldn't hurt US Canada relationships because that's tight anyway. But I don't know. This is something that again, no one's been paying any attention to the looming problem with Mexico specifically. Um, of course, Trudeau is a lame duck. Whether he's going to go down with the ship or leave early, I think it's still a open question. I will offer to send Nancy Pelosi up there if he needs to be convinced that he's got to leave before the vote.
Fuck, I'd pay for her airfare if she wants to get him out of here quite sooner than later.
Um, but I don't know. That's going to be a discussion and work in progress, I think, on the whole tariff thing. But back to the original source of that tangent, it is identifiable, supposedly, where China is, setting up shop in Mexico and evading tariffs that way, and Trump will deal with that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. As I say, it was another kind of tariff tangent situation that you're not really sure what's going to come about being out of all of that. So
Yeah.
this doesn't necessarily sound economic, like an economic problem, but there's the illegal immigration issue within your country. He's planning for mass deportations. That sounds to me to be, hugely expensive. And again, inflationary, because a lot of these illegal immigrants are working in food processing, in low-paying jobs that most Americans really don't particularly want to be filling. So they are serving a need, and if they go and they have to pay for American labor to go in there, that's going to raise food prices, which again is somewhat inflationary, not even taking into account the amount of money the government itself would have to pay in order to to deport it. It's a simple, it's simple to say just throw them all out of the country, but they do have due process. And right now, the backup in immigration courts right now is on average 1,019 days. So if you start a mass deportation, that average amount of time is going to increase. And the American government's got to basically food and shelter, uh, you know these, people while they wait for in detention while they await a final outcome of their hearings. So, um, is that actually going to be on, or is he going to be increasingly more selective as to who should be in the crosshairs to be deported?
Well, look, let me push back on that in a couple of different ways. I'm going to do it in a very persuasive way that the Vice President-elect J.D. Vance did when he was asked that question along the way. Logistically, economically, and otherwise, to take whatever the number is, 15, 18 million, 12 million, everybody disagrees with it because to a great extent it's not known. They don't have everybody accounted for. Nobody ever has. It's a logistical impossibility, especially when you did what the Biden administration and Harris did, and just throw the border wide open, and you don't even catalog the majority of people coming through, let alone catalog them and then forget about them. So, look, if you look at the job situation during Biden's term, and I'm oversimplifying this to make the point, for all of the alleged job gains that occurred, a disproportionate amount of them were on behalf of immigrants and native born Americans, and the Labor Department itself put this out. Native born Americans lost jobs. Okay, so the idea that we need immigrants because there aren't any Americans out there to fill the jobs, that's nonsense to begin with on its face. Number one. Number two, yes, when you do have documented immigrants or people here with green cards or people that come and become citizens, a lot of times they do work for cheaper wages. And I've always said that I admire anybody who legitimately, not if you're a terrorist, not if you're a gang member, not if you just got released from prison and you're going to go to America because of the open door policy of Biden and Harris. But I admire anybody who tries to better their lives and themselves. I said years ago that when you look at a lot of the people coming here from Mexico, just to use that as an example, most of them are devout Catholics, or at least have that in their upbringing. They're family oriented. They want to work hard and they'll work their asses off and they'll do it for nothing. They don't mind having three families in one house sometimes. And I don't say that in any way as a demeaning way, because in some way that does put the soft Americans to shame. But I think it's a gross overstatement to say, well, we have to hold our nose and allow this because we don't have enough people in our own country to do these jobs. That's not entirely true by a long shot. That's the first thing I would say. Secondly, there are a lot of people that are known, and I do think it's going to be a logistical nightmare, but I do believe it is necessary to go after people who can be documented as, first of all, and this is where Trump will start because it's the crazy phrase in this context, but it's the low hanging fruit. But people are out there that they know about that have got records that do have rapes and murders and things on their record. And yeah, a lot of these people do need to be deported. We don't have a country that automatically owes the rest of the world a living or free health care or free tuitions or anything else. And it's been ridiculous the extent to which we've let down our guard as a nation. And no nation is safe that doesn't have secure borders. I remember the very first time, Mike, years ago, when I had somebody explain to me in an investment context what it took back in those days in the 80s and 90s to emigrate to Canada. You basically had to have the means to buy your way into the country and to buy your citizenship. You had to bring something with you and be productive. And to this day, a lot of other countries on this planet are the same way. We're the only suckers who, for some wacky reasons, let everybody into the country as we've done. So that needs to reverse. I don't question that, and I support President Trump in that.
But will it not be, as I say, the argument is that going to add to the inflationary pressures?
There's way bigger things that are going to be inflationary or the opposite beyond trying to deport at least some of this influx of people. The worst examples you can find, and again, the ones that are demonstrably criminals and whatnot. That's not going to move the needle one way or the other on inflation. It's going to be a pain in the butt logistically for whoever's got to do this. But there's things, tax policy, tariffs, things like that are going to, be much more uh, needle moving inflation wise or in the other direction than this whole subject.
Okay. Well, you touched upon tax policy. Let's go down that rabbit hole next. Um, the last round of Trump tax cuts were coming up for renewals, so I'm pretty much guessing those are going to be renewed. Is he gonna pile onto it, and is it going to be the same beneficiaries?
Well, look, I think that you're looking at, to some extent, an element of this is warmed over trickle down economics, which can be productive if it helps to, if it really does trickle down and it broadens the tax base. A history lesson real quick. Ronald Reagan enacted tax cuts, uh, substantial declines to capital gains taxes, corporate taxes, the top marginal tax rate. Everybody said it was going to bust the budget. It didn't. The massive gains over 8 years in money coming into the treasury. So the Laffer curve was legitimate. And the idea that if you lower tax rates, you increase overall tax receipts because you've got a stronger economy, that was legitimate. But when Reagan left office, the annual deficit, had increased more than fivefold from the scandalous level it was under Jimmy Carter. And the reason it did is because he did nothing to rein in spending over that time. He actually boosted spending, mostly for military, but he didn't slow down the growth of government by any stretch of the imagination. And that's where Trump could have a different outcome if he's got the backbone to turn loose people like Elon Musk and others and go in and take a meat cleaver to the parts of the federal government that need it. Don't forget that, and I saw a great meme on this a week or so ago, where somebody made the point that if you could find every place on the internet that talked about the threats to democracy, democracy's on the ballot, democracy's under threat, we're losing our democracy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you had an AI program and could go every place out there in the ether, in the cloud, the World Wide Web, whatever you want to call it, and substitute the word bureaucracy for democracy, that's what's under threat. You've had 80 years since the end of the Second World War to build a leviathan of a deep state, a military industrial complex, a surveillance state, a foreign policy state, an administrative and bureaucratic state, all of which are the opposite of what the founders of this country had in mind in limited constitutional republic. And nobody has seriously gone after that to speak of. And this guy now, meaning President Trump, he's going to have a Republican House, most likely a Republican Senate on his side. Unlike the first time in Trump 1.0, he has never Trump Republicans that are going to oppose him, as many of them did back then, joining up with the Democrats. And he's got a free hand to be a truly revolutionary president and whittle this thing down to size, starting with, and I sure hope he has the brains to listen to Bobby Kennedy on things like this subject, especially. We do not need to be starting wars with Russia. We do not need to be starting a war with China. We do not need to be occupying half of the rest of the world. We do not need a military budget that is greater than the next 20 countries combined spend on the military. That's way past time for the promises of Trump 1.0, which were to whittle the military industrial complex down, to stop the idiocy of Democrats and Republicans alike who lied us into wars that cost lives and zillions of dollars. We need to put NATO on history's scrap heap where it belongs. It still does. And he promised to do that, all these things. In his first presidency, he didn't do any of it. Instead, he left office bragging about having a bigger military budget than any of his predecessors. If that's going to be his mindset, he's screwed. and he's going to go down in history as what everybody warned that he was, a buffoon and a blowhard that went beyond anybody else in destroying the federal budget and the debt and the whole thing. If he's got the nerve to fight this and finally root it out, he will go down in history as one of the greatest heroes. And then it'll be legitimate when some people say they got to have an extra carving out on Mount Rushmore for him.
Well, yeah, that was going to be my next point. Like he did in his first term kind of spend like a drunken sailor and
That's right.
expanded government, expanded the military. And that was going to be my question. Why is it different this time? And, and I guess that would be the open end where, only time will tell what actually ends up happening.
Look, I
But
think there is. I think there is, Mike. And I don't say this just because my heart wants it, but because I do see some evidence. There is a different vibe around Trump 2.0 than there was around Trump 1.0. He realizes, I think, at least he claims to, the mistakes he made and the people he surrounded himself with in Trump 1.0. We're going to see the proof of that, hopefully, as it evolves between now and the inauguration, as he puts together a cabinet, as he puts together more defined policy choices, et cetera. But I want to see him turn Elon Musk loose with no limitations. Okay. You don't have to touch entitlements, even. You don't have to touch Social Security. Maybe you tweak the Affordable Care Act if there are legitimate ways to make it more efficient. But there are three major things that this president can do that will allow him to succeed and have a strong economy and strong markets, rebuild our infrastructure and all this kind of stuff, but not blow up the budget. All right. Number one, as I said, the military has got to be belatedly whittled down to size. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year could be saved if we act like a republic again and a good neighbor and friend to the rest of the world rather than imperial power that says you do it our way or we'll bump off your leader and install somebody who does what we want. That's got to end. It's way past time for that. So that's the first thing he can do that right in one fell swoop will save hundreds of billions a year or more all by itself when you look at all of the related costs. There are ways, I'll put a 1A there, that a lot of federal agencies, a lot of things are not, vital to life. Again, it's that bureaucracy thinking it's under attack. You've got people who over 8 decades, if we go back just to the end of the Second World War, have built up this colossus of an administrative state, and they all now think they're entitled to the status, to this power, to these salaries, just because it's a be all and end all for them. Much of these things in Washington don't do a damn bit of good for the American people of the world. They just eat up money and office space. They've got to be rooted out. So you got that. Number two, there are ways to broaden the tax base. Larry Fink put something, I think yesterday or today in the Wall Street Journal, and said, look, if infrastructure spending and some of these pro-growth things the president does are done right, and you broaden economic growth, you broaden the tax base, that will be a net positive because it will bring in more tax receipts. The biggie that I am going to have some hopefully indirect hand in because I've got a couple of seats at the table, 2 or 3 people removed. That's a story for another day. Is that our listeners, I beg you, especially if you're in America, but even if you're not, to search for the Coalition for a National Infrastructure Bank. It's out there. This is something that's been done before in U.S. history. Franklin Roosevelt did it with, among other things, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation during the Depression. There are ways where, believe it or not, I'm going to remove, I'm going to say the emperor has no clothes. We're going to look behind the curtain. It is not sacrosanct that everything that is done for the public needs as a first matter to be borrowed from the central private bank called the Federal Reserve at interest. Look up the Coalition for National Infrastructure Bank. I believe President Trump is warm to this kind of an idea where you have a public-private partnership that the federal government sets up the structure of, enables, but after that, it leaves it in the hands of the private sector with specific means to raise money from investment markets. It's already out there, securitize this money and fund everything from infrastructure to shoring up our dilapidated and at-risk power grid, to building the economy of the future, to funding mines, to funding gigafactories, all these kind of things, where it's money done as a first matter, not starting from the federal budget and just adding to the deficit, but where the fruits of this in a bigger, healthier, more vibrant economy will broaden the tax base, lead to millions of high paying jobs. And on the back end, that will pay taxes directly into the treasury. He's got to have the courage to do stuff like this and not be told by the academics, oh, you can't cut out the Federal Reserve. I would say something like Elon Musk said about advertisers one time, but not on a family network here, so I won't use that word. But the hell with the Federal Reserve. Okay. The other thing he can do, and one of the people also in his corner, I'll go back to Bobby Kennedy Jr. Once upon a time, his uncle decided he wasn't going to be told by the Federal Reserve, well, there's only so much we can do to help the economy out. And John F. Kennedy said, really? Then we're going to print United States notes and they will circulate along with Federal Reserve notes because the American economy needs a helping hand. And I'm not going to pay interest for it. Stuff like this needs to be done because if it's not, Donald Trump 2.0 is doomed because the math doesn't work. If he's going to just do conventional capitalist Republican politics and not take some of these bold steps, which he now has for the next 2 years, some political capital to do.
So let's move on from that topic.
How was that long rant?
That was a good long rant, and that was actually very well placed. And it takes us to the next discussion because we deal in mining a lot, both of us, and the mining industry in the United States has been reft with permitting issues, lagging. The government saying, "Yeah, yeah, critical metals," but not giving, the ability for the mines to produce the critical metals that they need for to supply industry in the country, and it's kind of holding everything back. And I guess ultimately that infrastructure bank could be a way to help fund some of these mines down the road. But um, there's all sorts of other messes. Does Trump start to clean that up? Because realistically, we haven't heard a whole lot from Donald Trump about mining other than oil and gas. So we really, do we know what he's going to do?
We're going to quickly have mine baby mine as prominent as drill baby drill because some of his drill baby drill and his promises on energy have been unrealistic, but there is an awful lot of room for him to streamline the permitting process, free up a lot of our own in-ground assets, and we've got a lot of them. Belatedly, the Biden administration started to do some of this, but the bottom line is, incredibly, and everybody knows this, even Kamala Harris knows this because you saw her putting forth a lot of pretty aggressive proposals for things like strategic stockpiles of critical materials, things like subsidies for development so that you've got price certainty and you can get lithium and nickel and copper mines funded, et cetera. But we are way behind. I mean, I don't think anybody, even Biden supporters, would have thought that after now nearly 4 years of Bidenomics and the Green New Deal, such as it was, and things like this, that we are actually in a place now where we are farther behind China in competition on a lot of these different things, but we are. And so, to be fair, I think the people that Kamala Harris would have had around her were going to accelerate this, but Trump's going to accelerate it more. For starters, we will not have the disastrous Interior Secretary that we've had for the last 4 years. She'll mercifully be gone. And we'll have somebody in there who is going to be more amenable to doing the things that need to be done to make sure that you don't have, you know, NGO groups that don't live within 500 miles, for instance, just for sake of discussion, of a Resolution Copper or a North Met or Twin Metals or whatever, that can file lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. We're not going to have any longer these multiple permitting layers where you have to go back and do many of them over again because someone didn't like the way punctuation was. There will be statutes of limitations as far as how much time you have to challenge these things. Some of that's already being put in place this last year. So yeah, I mean, I see the Trump administration moving very quickly to right some of these wrongs because that is one of the things needed to put us in a better place is to develop the resources that we have within our own four walls and to do more to help our allies. You know, well, I know, and I had this conversation today when I was talking to somebody about the Yukon and their project. I mean, the Defense Production Act is already, got money that they're funding things in Canada, Africa, and elsewhere, and that's going to continue. We will see an enhanced effort to fund development stage projects where allies are, but an even greater uh, effort that I think Trump will not allow to do some of these things in our own country. So that'll be good, and it's long overdue.
Yeah, no, yeah, it is, and I agree that both sides actually sees the need for this. So I'm actually somewhat optimistic that we actually might see some movement in that area under this regime, given that the Democrats actually see this as being part of the future as well. So we may get some, dare I say, bipartisanship on this front to move things forward. But we've seen that with Manchin, who's just retired, and Senator Barato in Wisconsin with the Permitting Reform Act. We saw broad bipartisan support of the nuclear energy and the need for more uranium mining and processing in the United States. So, um, as I say, I remain the cockeyed optimist with it going forward
Oh,
that we may
well,
see
and you should. I mean, it's
some
it's it's
stuff.
coming, and it is coming in a bigger way.
Yeah. So yeah, he's been, president-elect here now for approximately 48 hours, give or take. And he hasn't even started to form a cabinet or anything yet. So I think we've beaten the Trump horse as far as we can.
Yeah.
Um, but that wasn't the only major thing that happened this week. This afternoon, even after we just told the Fed to go to hell about 5 minutes ago into this diatribe, we had a Fed meeting today where they said interest rate policies yet again. A quarter point drop and lots of talk.
Yeah, this, for the most part, with one exception, which I'll talk about in just a second, this was probably the most anticlimactic Fed meeting in a very long time. No one was surprised by anything. Everybody and their dog and the fleas on the dog knew it was going to be a quarter point rate cut. They knew that the Fed was going to say that, well, the economy's still doing well, so we're going to, play it by ear. We may not cut any more aggressively. Maybe they'll skip a meeting here and there. They're still going to go. We're not going to get a new dot plot until the next meeting, so we don't know what their mindset has changed since then. The last dot plot, the terminal low rate for the federal funds rate that they envisioned was a hair north of 3%. The markets are pricing in, and I think correctly so, a bit more than that. I think they're like, if you look at I think it was late next year's futures, I think they're looking more like 375 on the federal funds rate, 350 to 375. That's probably more realistic, especially since a lot of what Trump is going to do out of the gate, even if he is going to, look at implementing some of these more spectacular and unconventional notions that I've discussed, we are going to have a flare up in inflation again next year. No question about that. The consolation prize will be that the odds of a full blown recession will likewise have diminished a lot because of that as well. So I mean that's the trade off. Um, but the Fed is going to have to react to that. They're going to have to take into account fiscal policy, and especially if they see the possibility of the budget blowing out and so forth, they're going to slow down their rate cuts because they're going to have to deal at least somewhat with the bond market vigilantes who are rearing their heads again. And you've had and I referred to this recently, I've referred to Stan Druckenmiller, who is shorting treasuries. I've referred to Paul Tudor Jones, who acts as if he's shorting treasuries. This afternoon, Jeff Gundlach, who recently sold his successful trade in long-term treasuries, and all three of them suggesting, correctly so, that you need to have your head examined to be buying long-term treasury bonds right now until all of this sorts itself out. Because, barring something massive, or barring Trump actually going in and taking a meat axe to the Leviathan, administrative, state, military, both, we're going to have much higher deficits down the road if we have tax cuts, but not enough growth to go with it. So, again, I don't want to beat a dead horse. He's got the ability and the tools and the minds around him to really be unconventional and upend in a favorable way this whole thing. But until then, the Fed is going to stay slow. The one thing I wanted to add, though, that was probably the only eventful comment of the press conference, is that when he was asked, Jerome Powell said no, he will not step down if Trump asks him to. So he's going to stay there. So in that event, Trump's choices are, depending on who he chooses as Treasury Secretary, to do an end run around the Fed and the bond market vigilantes both, and have some type of Treasury enforced yield curve control, which has been done before. Um, that would make treasuries, though, even less investable. And one of the things Jeffrey Gundlach said this afternoon, and I had to put my go down memory lane, because this was just as I was getting into this industry. But if you go back to like 1980-ish time frame or so, you had lower yields on bonds from IBM that you did on long-term treasuries. IBM was deemed to be a safer bet. So we may be going back that direction for all I know. But no question, there's going to be some battles between Trump and the Fed. When you're a mercantilist and that's the policy you want, and this is no surprise because he made this known during his first term, he's going to want a lower and cheaper dollar. He's going to want lower interest rates, because that's how, if you're a mercantilist, you compete better, and you have more of an opportunity to export as well as import. So again, we're starting this from not a good place. But we'll see what's happened. That's one of the reasons why, when I was, yesterday, when the stock market was up 1,500 points on the Dow and bond yields were way up, but the dollar was also up, and they're calling that the Trump trade. And I said, well, I don't know what people are smoking if they think Trump trade is a stronger dollar, because it's quite the opposite.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree with you, but you took the wind out of one of my questions, which
Okay.
was, given that the Fed chairman was on Donald Trump's shit list, how long he was going to last as the Fed chairman. So you've addressed that, but let's talk about the Trump
And
trade.
his term, Mike, I should add, his Trump or Powell's term is up in January of 28. So for 3 out of 4 years, assuming, the president has good health and makes it through 4 years, 3 of those 4 years, he's got Jerome Powell as his Fed chief.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Trump trade. The election came out. There was the big jump in the U.S. dollar. There was a big jump in the stock market. There was a sell-off in precious metals. I think there was even a sell-off in treasuries, if I'm not mistaken. Um, I'm looking at it. The markets seem to be rather ebulliently optimistic that Trump is going to deliver on everything that he's promised, and we've discussed some of the difficulties that's going to be faced there. Do they get buyer's remorse in this Trump trade reverse?
Eventually, and I said this even before the votes were being counted, that keep in mind, I'm paraphrasing what I wrote, but keep in mind that just like following a Fed meeting, where more often than not, you have two or three false signals as things zigzag until the market figures it out a little bit better. You get these knee-jerk reactions. Oh no, that knee-jerk reaction wasn't right. This one is. Oh no, this one is. That we were going to get that following the election. And sure enough, we did. Now, a lot of the moves from yesterday, as we're recording this on Thursday, reversed today. Gold was down $85 today. It got back a decent part of that. The bond yields shot up by 18 basis points. I think it was yesterday. Gave some of that back today. The dollar gave back a fair bit of its jump from yesterday. So, there's going to be some volatility, which part of it is created by the algorithms to feed all the traders so they can, line their pockets. But, the bigger picture really is, at what point do the markets come to a reckoning with the fact that the great stagflation is still going to be here, and that there are more reasons than not, many more, in fact, that inflation will percolate higher again as we get into next year, especially if we don't have a recession, especially with all the liquidity still out there, and especially if we're going to get all of these additionally stimulative tax breaks from Trump. So the market at some point is going to have to come to grips with that. And, right now it's all selfish and short-sighted. Yes, it'll be good that a lot of regulations, banking and otherwise, are going to be pared back again. So that's a bullish thing. That's part of the excuses or explanations, whichever term you want to use, for the rally so far and the continuing bullishness. But I got to go back to say that, okay, there are some, and again, I'm hoping and praying for this and hope to see and be part of it, that we have some really revolutionary things like an infrastructure bank, like cutting the Fed out of it. And this is a perfect excuse for Trump. You want to get mad at Jerome Powell? The hell with him. Let him stay over here. Let's us talk about United States notes. Let's talk about a commission setting up a national infrastructure bank and some of these other things. Pretty cool stuff, if when you think about it, and that's possible. But aside from that, I've got to point out that there is going to be a reality check. I just pointed out in the newsletter I just sent out, actually election night, that for the first time in, I think it's 12 or 13 years, Warren Buffett, after selling chunks of additional positions in Apple and Bank of America and otherwise in the recent past, for the first time in 12 or 13 years, he has more cash in his portfolio than he has portfolio in his portfolio. Cash is greater than stocks. And it hasn't been that way since, we were in the wake still of the global financial crisis. So he sees something coming. A lot of other people who are warning about, the bond market vigilantes are going to keep long-term interest rates high, probably go higher into the next year. The stock market has not come to grips with that yet. And so there will come a point where I think it has to. And unless Trump takes some of these extracurricular and revolutionary measures, which I hope he does, if he doesn't, he's going to be facing a bigger bond market rebellion next year, and a stock market that isn't going to look so good.
Yeah, well, it's like we've said in our pre-election. Does he really want this job? And, that was the question that we posed, given all the headwinds and all the challenges that have been stacking up over the course of the last several years. So interesting times indeed, Chris. And it's a good thing that they've set the table now for us to have something to talk about for the next 4 years, so we don't have to go, geez, what are we going to talk about, Chris? If people are going to want to follow your musings on things as we go forward and they start to become clearer, how do they do so?
Simply go to nationalinvestor.com. If you're not already on my mailing list, sign up. Doesn't cost you a nickel for that anyway. If you want a paid membership, there's information on that there as well. If you want all of my specific portfolio and investment and stock and recommendations. But look, I when you and I talked about this a few weeks ago, and I laid out the landscape for both possibilities, my conclusion with Trump was that we will have higher inflation, perhaps even higher than under a Harris administration, but that at least as a consolation prize, it would be accompanied by somewhat better economic growth, a broader inflation where wages would go up, but also a lot of commodities will go up and things like that. I'm going to modify that just a bit today and say that if he takes these steps for an infrastructure bank, for finding ways to inject public credit without the Fed in a part of the equation, whether related to infrastructure or otherwise, he can pull off something far greater than the greatest political comeback ever, or at least since Nixon in the 60s. And he can be a transformative leader who will take the shackles of banking and confiscatory taxes and stifling administrative states off the back of everybody. The example he leads can change the world. And it's not a coincidence that right after Trump was elected, the German government collapsed. And they're now going to have to go back to the drawing board because a lot of people in Europe who have had a far worse go of things, up in Canada, that in a lot of these respects has had a far worse go of things under Justin. The whole world is ready for growth, for a lack of militarization, and for a positive world going forward. And this guy that they tried to label as all these nasty things, he can be the enabler of not only this kind of a revolution in America if he does things right and keeps the right people around him, and more important, keeps the neocon bastards and the rest away from him. He can not only change this country, but the world. And I sincerely hope and pray every day that he does.
Yeah, and if people want to actually come and talk to us in person, they're going to get a chance to really soon. You and I are both going to be down at Brian Lundane's 50th, and appropriately the golden anniversary of the New Orleans Gold Show, or as it's New
That's right.
Orleans Investment Conference, as it's now known, on from the 25th to the 23rd of November at the Hilton Riverside in New Orleans. If you're in the area, come pop by. You'll see Chris. You'll see me. We're more than happy to talk to anybody that cares to talk to us.
Absolutely. It's going to be fun. I look forward to that.
Absolutely, it'll be good to see you in a couple of weeks, and I look forward to any of our listeners that pop by to say hello.
Take care.
You too. The Prospector News Podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.